Today kicks off Unit 3. To review, Unit 2 was all about UIKit and iOS fundamentals, right? So we started Unit 2 talking about UIKit classes. We started talking about UI button, right? UI controls, UI views. We got into like UIKit classes fundamentally. We ended off talking about UI table views for about 2 weeks, right? And the data we got for those table views were either from an array or from a dictionary, right? Unit 3 is all about internet and networking and getting data from some internet service, right? This is what Unit 3 is about. The entire of Unit 3 is about getting data from the internet or sending data back to a web server, right? So what are we talking about? We're talking about the internet today. What is the internet? We all use the internet, right? Everything we have now is pretty much connected to the internet in some way or the other, right? Whether it be our Amazon Echo, our Apple Watch, our Android Watch, our iPhones, they're all connected to the internet, right? They're all connected to the internet. They all have what's known as an IP address, right? Whether it be local, right? There's an IP address that the internet knows who is asking for that particular information. How do I know who's asking for that information? So there we have an IP address, right? So finding my local computer has an IP address, and where I'm going to, whether it be google.com, apple.com, amazon.com, that itself has an IP address as well, right? But we do not type in IP addresses, right? We do not type in 192.168.2.1. We barely remember web addresses themselves, right? The minute you go after the com, it's like all blurry at this point. So the internet, what do we do to combat that? There's what's called a DNS. It's a domain name server. Basically, it takes that IP address, that 192 or whatever it is. It takes that IP address, it converts it to my google.com or my apple.com, right? This is how we're able to type in some URL, press enter, and get some feedback or some response from the web address we're looking for. We do not type in 192 or whatever it is, right? We do not type in that IP address. We type in some DNS specific name. The communication between our phone or our computer and the internet, that communication, right? We speak English right now. I'm speaking English to you. That's the way I communicate with you. The way internet communication happens is known as TCP/IP. I'm not going to go in depth with what TCP/IP is, but for now, know on the surface, the way computers communicate with each other is through this protocol called TCP/IP, okay? This is the language, right? That's the language they use to communicate with each other. HTTP is Hypertext Transfer Protocol. What's HTTP? We type in HTTP:// to whatever domain we want to go to, right? As of 1999-ish, in the 2000s there, that was no longer secure. HTTP by itself is no longer secure for making things like bank transactions or putting in your credentials. Anytime you put in your credentials, make sure that it's not in an HTTP address, okay? That's not enough. Make sure if you put in your credentials in some website, any website, make sure it's secure. The way you know it's secure, it's HTTPS. Everybody with me? So that S on the end of the P there is secure. It tells you at least that the website is secure. How is it secure? Again, we're not going to go in depth here, but it's secure using an SSL certificate, okay? The web server, the developers of that server, they have a SSL certificate that they package with their web API to secure it, right? I want to make sure that my TD Ameritrade, which today got bought by Charles Schwab, if in case you're interested in that one, that's a big merger. If I have a brokerage account, I don't want to use an HTTP, right? It has to be HTTPS. It has to be secure. I need to know as a consumer that I'm putting my credentials or my bank account information in some secured website, okay? At a high level, this is the basics that we need for now to know about the web and how the protocols they use, okay? As we get closer to interviewing, please, anytime you're going into an interview, on-site interview, make sure that you're reviewing this page, right? You're reviewing that page and you know how to explain how the internet works. We'll go into how the internet works and how I get some web page being rendered, but knowing those basic concepts you need to know going into any interview. Even if you're a front-end or iOS developer, doesn't matter. You might be being interviewed by somebody who's on the server team. They'll ask you, what's the difference between HTTP and HTTPS? Right? You give them a blank stare, you've been in iOS development for 10 months, that's a red flag. Everybody with me? Those are the things where you have to know more, not just on the surface, right? Cool. Any questions so far about HTTPS, TCP/IP, DNS? Any questions so far? Okay. We won't use curl today. Forget about this step curl here. We'll use Postman. I'll get into what more Postman means later. But for now, let's take a look at this diagram. What does that diagram mean? So here we have two parties here. We have a server and we have a client. We have a server on the left and we have a client on the right. The server is that website that I'm interested in, right? Whether it be a browser, whether it be an API, we'll talk about APIs, right? That's the server, where I want to get the information from. The server serves me information. It serves me data. What is the client? The client is our browser. The client could be our iPhone using a browser. The client is the person requesting information. Everybody with me? As a matter of fact, that model should be better if it was flipped, right? Because the client is the one requesting the information. Right? So ideally, the server should be on the right, client on the left to model it better. So here, what does the request mean? I have an iPhone. I put in, I want to get sushi, right? I go to Yelp. I say I want to get sushi. What happens there, right? The minute I press enter, I say I want sushi. My client makes a request to the Yelp server, to the Yelp. The Yelp app that I see is just the app. It's the front end of the application. Right? When I press enter, a request is made in the back end, right, of the Yelp API or the Yelp app to request, hey, I need sushi, give me back all the information on sushi in that particular address or my particular zip code. So I have the client makes a request, the client is my phone, it makes a request to the Yelp API. The Yelp API itself sends back a response. That's the big part of this week, that response that we get back. The response that we get back is data, right? It's data in the form of JSON, right? I make a phone call, I ask for pizza, somebody else tells me, yes, you could get your delivery in 20 minutes, whatever it is. That's a response from the person I'm ordering from. The response I get back from the server is data. Data is formatted in JSON. Before JSON, it was XML, right? We're not gonna get into XML as far as the scope of curriculum, but I'll talk about what XML looks like, and I'll show you guys what XML looks like, right? But XML was a harder parsing language. JSON is more readable. It's easier to parse JSON as opposed to XML, okay? So more updated and more modern servers use JSON format to send back to the client. So today we'll see what JSON is, but JSON is the data, the response that we get back from that Yelp API or from that Foursquare, or from that Google Maps, right? Google Maps, you put in some address, you press enter, it makes a request. Hey, Google, I need information to get to First World Trade Center, right? That information I get back is data. It's that response I get back from that Google request. Everybody with me? For today, we should make sure that we're comfortable with talking about request and response. What's a request? A request is from the client, whether it be a browser, like when I put in canvas.com and I press enter, I'm making a request to get me canvas.com's information. What's that information on that website, right? I put in fandango.com, I press enter, that's a request. Request to the server, get me the page. On fandango.com, I put in movies for the week. That's the next request. I get back a response. It shows me the movies, right? That part of showing is the data. How do you show the user, how do you represent to the user what information it is? You don't show the user JSON or raw data, right? So today we'll be parsing JSON and making models to show the user what data they're requesting, okay? And keep in mind, the server could be a browser, the server could be an API. We'll see what APIs look like today with Postman. Any questions about request response server client? So again, server is where you're making the request from, where you're making the request to, meaning google.com, apple.com, Yelp, API, whatever it is. The client is your phone making that request, okay? Or the app that you're using making that request, okay? We'll talk more about HTTP response codes later, but for now, whenever we go to a website and we see, for example, a 404 error, that's a response from the server saying, hey, something went wrong. That page is not found, right? So either you don't have access to that page, meaning you're not authorized to that page, right? For example, if we have an assessment and you try to go fast forward into, right, Luba? You try to fast forward and see what the assessment is. You click on that GitHub link. It gives you a 404. You're not authorized to see that page, right? So a 404 is what that means. Here is the basic response codes. So anything that's 100, 1XX here, anything that's 100 is an informational request process, right? You do not see 100s too many times. The most important codes we see, or the frequent codes we see, is anything that's like a 200 code. 200 means successful, right? I make a user account, I press enter, the user account was created successfully, it gives me back a 201 response, meaning successfully created. So anything in 200 is good, right? 300 is more like full stack people working with 300 errors here, where they're redirecting people to a different site. For example, like an OAuth, where you try to make an authorization based on a different app. Like for example, when you go to Facebook, or you try to log in through some other service using Facebook, it redirects you to a different site, everybody? So that's the redirection there. We might get into it later into curriculum where we do OAuth. We might do an OAuth session, because a lot of APIs now are doing OAuth, so we might get into OAuth and see what that looks like. But 400 we see a lot, right? You try to go to a website, you don't have an authorization key, you get a 404. You're not authorized to see that page. 500, right? You might see it once in a while here. For example, if GitHub is down or if Slack is down, right? That's a server error. Everybody with me? That's why we talk about server again. Server is the person giving us that data, right? Twitter is down, oh my God, the world is falling. Right, that's a 500. Before, if you guys were old enough, maybe, right? You're probably 12. When we saw the whale, anybody remember the whale on Twitter? Right, Jahid remembers the whale. That was like early days of Twitter, right? Too many people using the, what's that? You remember the whale. Cool, so we had the whale where too many people were on the server. Twitter was still trying to make money, right? They didn't have enough server space. So their servers were just over capacity. So we used to get those 500 errors and they showed us a whale, right? That was the Twitter whale there back in the day. Now we should not see the Twitter whale anymore. There's enough VC money and the company is public, so all that is taken care of. Takes us into APIs. The big topic of Unit 3 is APIs. What's an API? I want to make sure that we know an API, we've been writing APIs, right? API encompasses anything that's public to a client. So for example, if we have a model, like our crayon model from our assessment, we had a crayon struct. Everybody remember our crayon struct? That in itself is an API. Why is it an API, right? An API is an application programming interface. What's an API really? An API is anything that's public, right? That the developer writes, that's able to be accessed by a next party, right? Meaning our crayon is public, I'm able to access my crayon struct in any program because it's public. Everybody with me? So that in itself is an API. When we talk about APIs with networking, what we should really be talking about is a web API. Right? A web API is still an API in the background, right? It's public, meaning I could access the information. It's a web API. So APIs don't, in the back of your head, please don't attach APIs with only being data from the internet. Everybody with me? If you write a program and you have your classes where other people could access that, those methods and properties on your classes, that's an API as well, okay? That's an API as well. The web API we'll be talking about today, for example, like a web API, for example, like a dog API or whatever it is, it's an API, it's public, I'm able to access it, right? Apple has APIs as well. We've been using Apple APIs, right? We've been using such APIs like UIKit, we've been using Foundation. All those build up to be APIs because they have public interfaces that we could interact with, right? How do we get access to UI table view data source? That's an API in itself. Everybody with me? Okay? So everything that encompasses public information for a next developer to use is an API. Okay? Keep that in mind. So we really need to update this and say what an API really is. And then this particular API here is a web API. We'll be talking about web APIs. Okay? As far as like how APIs work, we'll talk more about the fundamentals of APIs and what APIs are. But for now, know that the APIs we'll be using is known as RESTful APIs. Okay? RESTful APIs. That's one of the things you put in your resume, right? I'm comfortable with RESTful APIs. I know what they are. And modern developers, they're also using what's known as GraphQL. We might not get into GraphQL, but just know it exists, right? Again, that's how you get data. GraphQL is more dynamic into what you get as far as the data back from the web server, right? As opposed to RESTful APIs. A RESTful API, which we'll be using predominantly through the program, through Unit 3, a RESTful API gets you all the information from an endpoint. So if I say, for example, get me all the pizza restaurants in Long Island City, right? Get me the pizza restaurants in Long Island City. It gets me back all the pizza restaurants at that particular API endpoint. An endpoint is the URL. An endpoint is the URL that we'll put into Postman. We'll see what that is and we'll talk about it. Those things are better seen in demo. So the RESTful API gets you back all the information. As opposed to like a GraphQL, you could say exactly what data you want from that particular data point. Right, so that's the difference there, but for now, put that on the back burner, but just know GraphQL exists, it's more modern, it's more flexible as to the data you get. But throughout the program, we'll be using RESTful APIs, okay? Cool. All right, so everybody has Postman installed? Great. Let me get Postman here. Yes, sir.
How do I set up like the workspace?
Let's just all run it together and see what we have. So let's all run Postman and see what we have first. Downloaded the app. Did we all download the app before I get started? Anybody still downloaded, not downloaded?
No, I can't set up.
I want to get it to the state where there's nothing here. So if we all downloaded the app, that's the app we run. So type in command space and type in Postman. Type in command space, type in Postman. Everybody has it downloaded, correct? Okay. And if you press enter, you should see something very similar to your web browser, right? At the top here, you have an add button. Do we all see that add button? Let's see, 1 second. Let's see, get that to an empty space here. This should be what you have when you open up your Postman. That's very similar interface like I do. You have an add button here. Do we all have access to that add button? Yes? I just installed this yesterday as well to make sure that we all have the same version. So we should all have that same interface, correct? And I press enter. Oh, sorry, not enter, but I press on the add button. It creates me a new tab. Everybody has access to that tab, right? Let's talk about HTTP methods for a second. So the HTTP methods that we'll more likely use and most likely use here, the most common ones, if we click on where it says get here with the down arrow, do we see get? Click on the get arrow. Those are all known as HTTP methods. We have it in the lesson at the bottom. Here. Can we all see in the back? Okay, those are known as HTTP methods, right? The protocol currently contains 8 methods, but we have more as we saw Postman there. The most important methods that we are discussing, especially today, is get, right? Get implies get me information, as the name says. It's an HTTP method to get you some response from a server, right? Get me the information. That's the method. As opposed to Swift, that method is spelled out all in capital letters. Everybody sees that? Right? So that's the HTTP standard. Get me information. We'll also see post information. Post information is I've created a new user, right? I'm signing to Instagram. I've created a new user account. Go ahead and post that data. Send that data to the web server. This is post, okay? There's also delete, there's put. We'll talk about more of those as we get into them, right? But for now, the big one, the default that Postman starts with is get information, right? We're consumers of things, right? We like to get information, we like to consume, so get consumes information, get me information. Okay, so we have get, post, and as you see, there's more options here. There's patch, right? There's a lot of options. Those are one of the things too that we need to know as we go into an interview. Not necessarily on the phone, right? But when you go into that final interview or any interview that you go to on site, please guys, I'm gonna say it now, I'll keep saying it. Do not go into any interview, right, on site where you're not familiar with the more common HTTP methods or know what an HTTP method is. Everybody with me, okay? Those are the things where you have a checklist. As you go into an interview, you should know what those things mean, okay? You don't want it to be one server guy saying, oh, but he doesn't know what post is, or they're using get, but they still can't explain what get does, right? Cool. So let's go back to the lesson and go back to section 5, where it says hitting APIs using Postman. Everybody has access to the lesson, correct? So go to where it says hitting APIs using Postman. And what we'll copy where it says paste the link for all breeds. We'll copy from where it says HTTPS. Again, this is a secured site. HTTPS : / all the way to all, ALL. So I'll copy that URL. I'll go to Postman. Do we all see where it says enter request URL? Okay, enter it here, paste it in. Let me zoom in a little bit here. So for now, what have we seen? This particular HTTPS here is known as an endpoint. Everybody? If you're taking notes, this is where I'll say take the notes here. So this is an endpoint. It's an endpoint to a RESTful API. Okay? That RESTful API will return us all the breeds for a dog. At this point, we haven't made any request. We haven't done this part of the lecture. We haven't done the actual request from the client. We have not done this particular request. We haven't done the request. So let's go ahead and make the request using Postman. So in Postman, to make a request, I'll click on send. Do we all have access to the send button? Do we all see the send button? So I'll click on send. And here I made a request. I got back my response in the form of what's known as JSON. This here is JSON data. Right? Again, if we look closely here, do we see the option that says JSON here? Where I'm zooming in? So those are the formats from the data. You could format it in XML if XML is available. You could format it in HTML, in text, or you can make it automatic. Right? We want it to be in JSON because JSON is easier to be read. Swift now makes it easier for us to use JSON data and make our models from it, right? So overall, JSON is a much more better experience than we had before. Right? JSON works nicely with Swift now. We'll talk about how we take that JSON data and make our Swift models today. But for now, we're able to make a request using the dogs API endpoint and get back a response.